In the last video, we looked at 5 of the biggest mistakes that contributed to Oldsmobile's premature demise. If you haven't seen it yet, I recommend watching it now. In this video, we'll consider 5 missed opportunities, things that Oldsmobile could have done or should have done between the mid-90s and early 2000s. So, let's get started. As mentioned in the last video, the Aurora was meant to supersede the Toronado, and eventually the 98, and even the 88. However, it was only available with a V8 that required premium fuel, and it had so few options that it was essentially fully loaded from the factory. That made it quite expensive, both to buy and to run, whereas those other cars were more affordable and cheaper to run. Plus, the Aurora's release heralded the arrival of a new generation of Oldsmobiles as the brand's flagship. It would attract potential customers into dealerships, and if they couldn't afford an Aurora, there were new, smaller, more affordable cars coming. But not for several years. The Aurora needed lower trim levels to be more accessible to the target audience, especially if it was meant to supersede all the other full-size models and keep attracting new customers until the new generation of smaller cars arrived. First and foremost, it needed a V6 option. The logical choice would have been the venerable 3800, which powered the cars that the Aurora was meant to replace. However, Oldsmobile's general manager at the time was John Rock, who really didn't like that engine. He didn't believe it was a bad engine, he just hated the fact that it was installed in pretty much every car that GM made. He really wanted an exclusive engine for Oldsmobile. Okay, so what were the options? They would develop the LX5 V6 for 1999, but that was way too late, since it was the last year of the first generation Aurora. Plus, it was based on the Northstar V8 and had the same head bolt issue, so be careful what you wish for. Another option might have been the twin dual-cam LQ1, but that engine was rough and noisy at high RPM, so not very luxurious. In fact, later on they tried that engine in the prototype Intrigue and decided that the 3800 was better. So beggars can't be choosers. The Aurora needed a 3800 in the base model. It would have been easy to install too, because it was already in the Buick Riviera, which was built on the same platform as the Aurora. Also, a base model needed cloth seats as standard. The 1995 Aurora was available with cloth seats as a no-cost option, according to the sales brochure, so it's not too hard to imagine them as standard on the 3800 powered Aurora base model. Also, to make it more affordable, it could do without some of the high-end features, such as the trip computer or transmission shift modes. The Aurora was a great car that got Oldsmobile some attention, but if they'd given it a wider market appeal, it would have been a little easier for it to keep that attention until the Intrigue and Alero came to market. All the same though, it was still a bit of a stretch to expect the Aurora to replace all of the old full-size models. That leads us to another opportunity they could have taken. What happens when you put an American drivetrain into a German body and make it tough enough for Australian roads? You get the Holden Commodore. It was rear-wheel drive like the Opel it was based on, but its standard engine from 1991 onwards was the Buick 3800 V6. But even better, you could get the Commodore equipped with a V8 and a manual gearbox. The North American market didn't have anything like that anymore, and some consumers still wanted that kind of car. Before John Rock became Oldsmobile's general manager, he spent time in Australia managing GM's Holden division. He could see firsthand how good Australian cars were, and he realised that the local full-size cars could fill a gap in his home market. After taking charge of Oldsmobile in 1992, Rock pitched an idea to a General Motors executive to import the Holden Commodore and rebadge it as an Oldsmobile. And the exec was totally disinterested. One reason for this was that GM's upper management were very narrow-minded in terms of the direction they wanted GM to go. Another reason was that they really couldn't stand John Rock's personality and viewpoints. In fact, they were over the moon when he retired. So naturally, they dismissed his proposal to import Holdens. But what if they hadn't? There's actually a history of collaboration between Holden and Oldsmobile. Before Holden started making its own cars in 1948, they were assembling Oldsmobile and Buick vehicles for the Australian market, starting in the early 1900s and continuing until 1950. At that point, GM decided to pull Buick and Olds out of the Aussie market and let Holden have the place to itself, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me since Holden was more of a Chevrolet Pontiac equivalent, not a luxury brand. But anyway, that historic partnership could have made a bit of a comeback at the turn of the century, dovetailing nicely with Oldsmobile's retiring full-size lineup. The 88 and the 98 were mechanically very similar, with the main differences being the wheelbase, luxury features, and exterior design. The Holden Commodore and Caprice were very much like that as well. Also, the 1997 VT Commodore was purposely designed from the ground up to be offered in left and right-hand drive markets. As a result, it and the Caprice were exported to places like China, the Middle East, and Brazil. And since the standard engine was the Buick 3800 V6, it wouldn't have been too much of a stretch to send them to North America wearing Oldsmobile badging. Not right away though. The 88 was still in production, and the VT-based Holden Caprice wasn't ready yet, so there wasn't a 98 equivalent. Come 1999, and the new WH Caprice could have become the new 98. Then in 2000, the outgoing 88 could have handed the baton to the new VX Commodore. Come to think of it, that strategy would have been appropriate since new 98s had been released 1 year before the new 88s for the last 2 generations. One of the main drawcards of these Holdens would have been the fact that they were rear-wheel drive, just like the luxury imports. Even better, the Holdens were all available with V8 power and American passion. Perhaps Oldsmobile could have used that to steal some thunder from the Mercury Grand Marquis and Lincoln Town Car. After all, those cars were so popular because of their traditional layout. And the icing on the cake? Both V6 and V8 Commodores were offered with a manual transmission. North America needed this car. Oldsmobile's bread and butter were their medium and large cars. The 88 was a popular car, but after 1999 there was nothing left in that part of the lineup, kind of like we saw with the Cutlass Ciera in the previous video. Getting these captive imports from down under would have been a great way for Oldsmobile to keep a full-size market presence, and it would have been able to offer Euro-inspired rear-wheel drive vehicles, which were badly underrepresented in domestic lineups. However, that said, there was another thing missing from the Oldsmobile lineup, something important that other GM brands had. Oldsmobile produced sporty prototypes of the Intrigue, the Alero, and even the Silhouette. They also made the Bravada Escape concept, a Bravada with the luxury of an Aurora and a 245 horsepower supercharged engine. That sounds pretty cool. I'd want one. So why didn't they make production cars like that? They did have the twin dual cam LQ1 V6 in the Cutlass Supreme, but that was discontinued in 1996, and the manual option retired 3 years earlier in 1993. The 98 touring sedan was last offered in that same year, although the supercharged engine option carried on until 95, and the LSS retired in 1998. They did have a bit of a unicorn from 1990 to 96. The Cutlass Ciera had a sporty version in an unexpected market, Mexico. It was sold alongside the Buick Century through Chevrolet dealers. Both cars were powered by the older 60-degree 3.1 V6 and 3-speed automatic, but the Cutlass had a trick up its sleeve. You could get a trim level called Eurosport with a 5-speed GetTrag 282 manual. So much for GM's least unique car. It would have been really cool if Oldsmobile had offered the Eurosport in the rest of the continent, maybe fitting it with the Ciera's standard V6s, the Buick 3300 and then the 60-degree 3100. Both engines made the same torque as the old 3.1 and just 20 more horsepower, so the GetTrag could have handled them. For the other models, the Intrigue could have easily had a variant with a supercharged 3800, like the other W bodies. The Aurora could have had a variant with the 4.6 litre V8. It already had a North Star-based engine, so why not? The Alero OSV concept had the 215 horsepower LX5 V6, so the production Alero potentially could have had it too. Now that would have been quite the sleeper. It's a real shame they didn't put cars like that into production. Sadly, it's not the only opportunity they missed. Considering that Oldsmobile had a trim level called International Series, it's quite ironic that they didn't really sell cars internationally. The only official markets were the US and Canada. In fact, even Canada didn't get every Olds available. The N-body Cutlass and first generation Silhouette were never offered there, and neither were the first two generations of the Bravada. Not selling a luxury four-wheel drive in the Great White North? That doesn't make any sense. This becomes even more ironic when you consider that Oldsmobile was actually the first American car maker to export a vehicle back in 1898, only a year after it was founded. In the early days, they were exporting to 18 countries. They were even building cars in Australia until 1950, as mentioned earlier. In a way, Oldsmobile was a global brand before Chevrolet even existed, and yet somehow Chevrolet ended up being GM's only global brand, which is odd, since a luxury car with a bow tie just doesn't make sense. In an alternative reality, Oldsmobile could have been GM's global luxury division, especially for markets that didn't have Cadillac. The global car market is incredibly complicated and varied, so I won't speculate about it too much. Let's just focus on smaller, specific regions. When Australia's GM Holden assembly division decided to make own cars, GM pulled the other brands off the market there soon afterwards. Not sure why they didn't keep at least one upmarket brand, but GM makes weird decisions like that. Considering how they had no fewer than 5 brands serving the US and Canadian markets, it's strange that they expected Holden to do everything from budget family wagon to performance sedan to luxury cruiser. In fact, they were trying to serve all sections of the market by just using different trim levels of the same car. In North America, that would be unthinkable. The Chinese market has exploded in size over the past few decades, and the local manufacturers like to have different brands for different purposes, like North America. Buick is incredibly popular over there. Today, the vast majority of Buick sales are in China. They even have models exclusive to the Chinese market. It's a major reason why Buick is still around. If Oldsmobile had sold cars there, maybe their story would have turned out differently. Canada is often overlooked as its own market. It's usually lumped in with the US, but there are some significant differences between the two markets. Canadians generally prefer smaller vehicles than Americans, and they tend to buy higher trim levels or more upmarket models. Hence, Mercedes-Benz sold the B-Class in Canada, but not in the States. More to the point, Pontiac and GMC sold many more cars there than Chevrolet did. In fact, Canada had a few exclusive Pontiac models, partly due to the dealership setup there. For some reason, Oldsmobile didn't take advantage of their market as much as they could have. For example, it makes very little sense that they didn't offer the Bravada in Canada until its third and final generation. After all, a luxurious four-wheel drive truck-based vehicle seems perfect for a country renowned for its long winters. Also, if the N-body Cutlass had been offered there, it most likely would have outsold the Chevy Malibu, due to the Canadian taste for smaller, more upmarket cars. But for some reason, that didn't occur to Oldsmobile's marketing team. Speaking of the Cutlass, that car in itself was a missed opportunity. There was a lot more that Oldsmobile could have done with it, which leads us to the last chapter of this video. This was probably their biggest blunder. As mentioned in the last video, the Cutlass Ciera was Oldsmobile's best-selling model even in its twilight years, which is the only reason it had such a long production run. Even GM themselves couldn't believe it was so popular, given how old-fashioned it was. The Ciera was 14 years old at that point, and it looked dated. And yet, that's what most customers were buying. It was the cash cow. The Buick Century was in the same situation, since it was kind of a sister car to the Ciera, being based on the same platform. Both the Century and the Ciera were hugely popular, but since the A-platform cars were quite old, A new generation was needed pretty soon, and here's where the two car makers go in different directions. Buick recognised that the next generation of Century should be the same kind of car. Simple, comfortable, reliable, traditional. They developed the next Century on the same platform as the new Regal, the W platform. And indeed, the two cars were similar. The Century was basically a Regal with a different engine and more traditional looks. Even so, the Century sold well, and it even lasted a year longer than the Regal. Sure, it was plain and basic, but at least Buick knew what they were doing. And then there's Oldsmobile. They really needed to follow Buick and design a new version of their best-selling car. But instead, they threw a lazily rebadged Chevy Malibu onto the market and hoped the people would just wait for the Alero. Here's the thing. The Alero was actually meant to replace the Achiever, a sporty compact. If certain customers bought a Ciera instead of an Achiever, would they have considered an Alero? That was a totally different kind of car. There was no way it could be the Ciera's real successor. And that's what its N-body sister car could have been, with just a bit more effort put into it. The bones were all there. It was the same kind of car as the Ciera. It had the same engine. It was even the same size. That's something it had over the Buick Century. The W-body Century was larger than the old A-body Century. However, the N-body Cutlass had almost identical dimensions to the A-body Ciera. The difference between them is only 2mm, or 1/10 of an inch. The size factor could have been a draw card for people who didn't want a bigger car. But still, to make it a proper successor, there are three main changes Oldsmobile should have made to the Cutlass. First of all, the design needed to be more unique. Oldsmobile could have easily made it much more than just a Malibu with a split grille and different taillights. More design differences would have gone a long way. Different bumpers, subtle chrome trim, a more distinct interior, a proper Oldsmobile steering wheel instead of a Malibu wheel with an Olds badge, etc. Secondly, it needed a bench seat. The Ciera only had a bench seat from 1993 on, and the W-body Century was only available as a 6-seater. And let's not forget Cadillacs, other Buicks and Oldsmobiles, as well as Ford's Panther platform. Say what you will about the old-fashioned bench seat, there's no denying that it was still somewhat popular for American cars, so the N-body Cutlass needed one to keep Ciera buyers happy. Thirdly, they should have put more thought into the name. The Cutlass Ciera dropped the family name for its last year, 1996. It was just called the Ciera. But the 1997 placeholder was called the Cutlass, which was a bit confusing, especially since the Cutlass Supreme was still on the market. They really should have called it the Ciera to keep the familiar name going. That would have also enabled the Cutlass Supreme's successor to still be called the Cutlass, as I touched on in the previous video. Now, one might argue that offering two different cars on the same platform would be a bit silly. However, Buick offered two different nameplates on the same platform and with mostly the same body panels, the Century and the Regal, and it still worked for them. So Oldsmobile could have offered both the Ciera and the Alero on the N platform and appealed to two different kinds of customer. As mentioned at the start of this chapter, this was probably the biggest opportunity that Oldsmobile missed, especially since they had most of the ingredients to make it work. They were so close, yet so far. Well, that was my take on 5 things that could have been done differently. Obviously, there's no way to tell if Oldsmobile's history would have actually changed much if they'd done things like this, especially if GM's upper management was still determined to close the brand anyway, as I talked about in the first video. Besides, as the saying goes, hindsight is 20/20. But since I have an overactive imagination, the final video will be a speculative fiction on what Oldsmobile's model lineup could have looked like if they'd taken those opportunities and not made those mistakes, and thereby survived into the 21st century. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the epilogue.